All right. Welcome back, Bio 153 students. I hope you're, feeling ready to go, ready to learn some more material. So today we're going to look at chapter 21, which goes over blood vessel anatomy and physiology. So I have here part 1. So we're going to be focusing just on the anatomy first, and then part 2 we'll be looking at the physiology. So that will be later on today that you'll see that. All right, so let's go ahead and learn about the anatomy here first. So first, taking a look at the basics. We look at blood vessels. So some of this information is review. Some of this is new. So blood vessels, the basics. So number 1, arteries. We've mentioned a lot about arteries in the past. And arteries are carrying blood away from the heart and transporting oxygen, nutrient-rich blood. And of course, there are some exceptions to this rule, such as in the human heart, the pulmonary arteries that we've mentioned before. And if you remember back to fetal circulation, we mentioned that with the umbilical arteries. Number 2, for blood vessels, veins. Veins carry oxygen, poor blood towards the heart. And exceptions to that would be the pulmonary veins that we've mentioned before in the human heart, and the umbilical vein in the fetus again. But capillaries, we haven't talked about capillaries yet. And today we're going to do that. So capillaries are ultimately very small. They make up quite a bit of microcirculation. And there's going to be very close proximity to tissue cells that these capillaries are serving. So ultimately directing and serving cellular needs. And so with the capillaries and tissue cells nearby, there's going to be lots of gas exchange occurring. And when we're looking at gas exchange, we're ultimately referring to the exchange of oxygen gas, so O2, and also the exchange of carbon dioxide gas, so CO2. But not only gas exchange will occur, you're also going to have exchange of hormones taking place. So examples of hormones again would be like insulin, or glucagon, or prolactin, or estrogen, and so on and so forth. There's also going to be the exchange of nutrients. So nutrients referring to fats, carbohydrates, proteins, etc. And even exchanging of waste products that build up in the cell going into the capillary and eventually removed. And a lot of these waste products would be things such as maybe urea or excess hydrogen ions. So those are some examples there for you. We're now going to take a look at the structure of arteries, veins, and capillaries. And we start off by focusing in on understanding the anatomy of the artery, and likewise looking at the anatomy of the vein. So both the artery and the vein have 3 main tunic wall layers. 3 main tunic wall layers. So the most internal layer is known as the tunica intima. Tunica intima. So that's the innermost layer, tunica intima. And ultimately the function for the tunica intima is to decrease friction, because this is the innermost layer that blood is actually going to be rubbing up against. So here in this image of the artery, the tunica intima would be right here. Okay? And in the vein, the tunica intima would be this innermost layer here. So with the pen here, tunica intima, again, is referring to this layer here. And likewise with the vein, referring to this area of proximity, looking kind of right there, and likewise right there. Okay, so that's referring to that tunica intima. Okay, the next layer we have is the tunica media. Media is referring to middle. So the function for the tunica media is for maintaining blood pressure and circulation. So we can see that here on the diagram, the tunica media, right here for the artery, and right here for the vein. So this area here, and this area here. And one thing you might see as a difference is that the tunica media is going to be much thicker in the artery in contrast to the vein. And so you probably noticed that when you're looking at the diagram here, right? Here's the tunica media of the artery, and here's the tunica media of the vein. So significantly thicker in the artery versus the vein. And the big reason for that, it comes down to differences in blood pressure. So when we look at the artery, blood pressure, of course, is going to be, right, high. So the tunica media functions maintaining blood pressure, so that makes sense. In contrast to the vein, in veins, the blood pressure tends to be pretty low. So hence, the tunica media evolved to be very thin here. So definitely something to keep in mind. All right, the last tunic wall layer we have is the tunica externa. The tunica externa. And the function of the tunica externa is protection and for anchoring. So that's the outermost layer, the most superficial layer, is that tunica externa. So right here in the artery and right here in the vein. So this whole area right here and right there. So very important to make sure to know that. Another term to be familiar with the artery and the vein is what's known as the lumen. Okay, the lumen. And this is referring to the area that the blood is actually flowing through the blood vessel. So this opening area here is ultimately the lumen. Okay, the lumen. And blood is flowing through that lumen. Okay, blood is flowing through that lumen. And you probably noticed that the lumen cross-sectional area is much thinner than the vein. And the reason for that is you have a lot more blood that's flowing through your veins than your arteries at any given period of time. So that's why there's this, ultimately, this large cross-sectional overall diameter area here. Another thing that veins have, the arteries don't, are valves. Okay, so you probably noticed this here. Here we have valves, and we typically find the valves in veins that are in your arms and legs. Okay, so these valves are typically found in your arms and legs and ultimately assist with movement of the blood. So they're found in your extremities here. Let's now take a look at our capillaries. Capillaries have designed to be very different from arteries and veins. They're a lot more simplistic. And so the only thing that capillaries have are what are known as endothelial cells. All right, endothelial cells. That's what they developed. That's all they have. So these are very, very thin one-cell layers here. And this picture here shows the endothelial cells. And in this image here, this is where we have our capillary network. So definitely a lot of important things to be aware of on this slide to know. Moving on, we're looking at some histology. So here we have the vein. So this is a picture here of the cross-section of a vein. And here we take a look at the artery. So here we look at the artery. So when we're looking at that vein versus that artery, we ask ourselves, why do arteries have a thicker wall versus the vein? Definitely really focusing in on that tunica media that we've mentioned. And that whole difference is because of the idea, again, of blood pressure. Okay? So blood pressure. It all comes down to blood pressure. Because in arteries, the blood pressure, again, is high. And blood pressure in a vein typically is going to be low. So if you were to identify an artery versus a vein, again, the artery has this large cross-sectional area here when it comes to the actual walls, especially the tunica media wall versus the vein. All right, so now we're going to look at the relationship of blood vessels. Okay, so the relationship of blood vessels and looking ultimately at blood flow through all of circulation. There are many different structures, different blood vessels here. So we start by looking at the arterial system. So the arterial system is referring to blood vessels that have oxygen-rich blood. Okay, oxygen-rich blood for their arterial system, hence color-coded as red. And so the blood leaves the heart. Of course, that major artery that the blood leaves through is the aorta. And eventually, the blood will make its way to what are known as elastic arteries. Elastic arteries. So the blood pressure is going to be, of course, a lot higher over here. Elastic arteries, for the most part, are going to be located near the heart. So just some examples here for you, so you have an idea here. What would be some examples? Well, definitely the aorta would be a great example here. Other examples would be such as the common carotid arteries. So common carotid are great examples here for you. Okay, so common carotid arteries. And there's a right and there's a left. So those are two great examples there for you. Also, the subclavian are great examples too. So the subclavian. And that's supposed to be there. So those are three examples there for you. Eventually, the blood is going to go ahead and get to even smaller arteries, and those are defined as muscular arteries. Okay, muscular arteries. Typically, these are arteries that are delivering oxygen-rich blood to various organs that are usually found in association with the digestive system or urinary system. So a couple examples here for you, so you have an idea. Some examples would be renal, so such as the renal artery. The term renal is referring to kidneys. Okay, renal refers to the kidneys. We also have another example, gastric. And the gastric artery, the term gastric is referring to stomach. So, stomach. Or another example could be hepatic. And hepatic, that term's referring to the liver. So you have a hepatic artery. Refers to the liver. So there are a couple examples there for you to consider. Eventually, the oxygen-rich blood will eventually make its way then to even smaller blood vessels known as arterioles. So those are pretty tiny. And then eventually the blood supply will get to the last arteriole known as the terminal arteriole. Okay, so you can see the direction we're going here in this picture. So this way, you can see that here, making our way to the terminal arteriole. And then eventually the blood will enter into the capillaries. And this is where the gas exchange occurs. So this is where the oxygen will come off, O2, and go to tissue cells. And in return, you're going to have carbon dioxide gas that's leaving the tissue cells. So CO2 referring to carbon dioxide, and that's leaving the tissue cells. Okay? All right, so from here now, with the high amount of CO2, low oxygen, now we're looking at oxygen poor blood. So everything in the blue is now referring to more of the oxygen poor blood. And now all these structures are a part of the venous system. All right, so we look at this now, and the first structure that the oxygen poor blood will make its way to is the post-capillary venule. Post-capillary venule. This is the first blood vessel off the capillaries. And then from here, the blood supply will then make its way into what are known as venules. So that is not indicated here, but I'll write it in here for you. We have what are known as the venules. Okay? So the venules. These are very, very small blood vessels, again, carrying oxygen poor blood. All right? The venules. Then from here, the oxygen poor blood will make its way to small veins. Small veins. And examples of small veins would be blood vessels that are very close, again, to various organs of the digestive system, renal system, urinary system, etc. So, just like we had the hepatic artery, we also have hepatic veins. So, hepatic veins. And hepatic, of course, is referring to the liver here. And just like we had the renal artery, we have the renal vein, again referring to the kidneys. Okay? And just like we had the gastric artery, we also have the gastric vein, right? So gastric. And gastric, of course, is referring to the stomach. And there's many other examples as well. All right, so this question here, what prevents blood from flowing back in the veins? And again, that answer would be the valves, right? The valves. And again, these valves found in veins, typically found in the extremities. All right, so moving on here, we have our blood that's leaving small veins and now eventually entering into large veins. Okay? So large veins, they're carrying quite a bit of blood. Ultimately, the goal is to going back to the heart. So some great examples here. And we're kind of running out of some room here, so we'll make some room here. We'll go ahead and do that. And some examples, you're probably thinking, I know, right? Of course, we have the superior vena cava. So that's a great example, superior vena cava. Ooh, we'll definitely fix that here for you. So we'll just do that. All right. So the superior vena cava. So looking at that here, superior vena cava. And of course, there's also the inferior vena cava is a great example. Right? So those are two great examples right there for you. So definitely make sure to review this. Very important concept to know. All right, so this kind of reviews what we just went over in case you can't read my handwriting. So here we go, right? We have a variety of different types of blood vessels that are oxygen rich. So we've already mentioned before the elastic arteries. Again, the majority of these are located near the heart. I've mentioned the aorta. I mentioned the common carotid arteries, subclavian artery. Those are all excellent examples. Then we have the muscular arteries. So again, these are typically a little smaller. They're delivering blood to various body organs. And I mentioned some of these already. The renal artery, gastric artery, mentioned that, right? I mentioned hepatic artery. This is one I didn't mention. This is known as the overall splenic artery. And this is referring to the spleen, okay? So there's others as well. I didn't mention all of them. There's also the superior mesenteric artery and inferior mesenteric artery. So they're delivering oxygen-rich blood to the colon when we're thinking of the intestine. And again, there's many others. And then the arterioles are very, very small blood vessels, and ultimately the goal is to transport the blood towards capillary beds. We now take a look at blood vessels that have oxygen-poor blood. Again, a lot of this is review. This way you can see it too if you can't read my handwriting. So we have here the venules, right? So the venules, they have the oxygen-poor blood, like all these blood vessels, and they're very small blood vessels. The first one, of course, the postcapillary venule. And then we get into the veins. Again, all these blood vessels have pretty low blood pressure. So small veins, example being like the renal vein, or the hepatic vein, or the gastric vein, etc. And then we get into large veins, such as the superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, as some examples there for you. We now take a look more at capillaries, and eventually we'll get into looking at the various types of capillaries. Again, when we look at the functions of capillaries, they're key for the exchanging of gases. We mentioned the two major types of gases, again, oxygen, so O2, and carbon dioxide gas, which is CO2. Again, you can see the other functions here, so nutrients, exchanging of various hormones, and even metabolic waste products. The capillaries are made up of endothelial cells, which are one cell thick. They're fairly thin walls, And even in the interior of the capillary, there's not a whole lot of room. And you can see this in the image I've provided here for you. So you can see the movement. Here we have a erythrocyte moving through, white blood cell moving through, so not a whole lot of room in there. A structure that capillaries have too is what is known as the pericytes. These are smooth, muscle-like cells, and they ultimately help with overall stabilizing the capillary walls and also controlling permeability. So one thing to consider, we see this question down here, well, why do capillaries have a one-cell layer wall? Why do capillaries have a one-cell layer wall? And the reason they're constructed like that, maybe you're thinking already, well, the big reason here is that it allows for easy exchanging of materials. So it allows for very, very easy movement for materials to come into the capillary and leave the capillary, especially if we think of gases, right? So very easy movement of oxygen to leave the capillary, go to the muscle tissue cells here, and vice versa. You have ultimately the movement of the CO2 leaving the muscle tissue cells and going to the capillary. So it makes it very easy for items to move back and forth between the capillaries. If we had very thick walls, it would be very difficult for gases to move. And likewise, the other items that are listed above, the nutrients, the hormones, etc. We're now going to take a look at the diversity of different capillary types in your body. The first type we're going to look at are what are known as continuous capillaries, the continuous capillary. This is by far the least permeable and by far the most common in the body. And they're typically found in your skin, the various layers of your skin, and also in your muscle, when you think of your skeletal muscle, for an example. So their overall permeability is fairly low. And so the reason for that, you can see here, there's tight junctions here, and the intercellular clefts are pretty much, that's a pretty small opening there. So this only allows for the passage of fluids, very small fluids and solutes here. So that's the first type of capillary in your body, is the continuous capillary. Number 2, the second type of capillary in your body is known as the fenestrated capillary. The fenestrated capillary. The fenestrated capillary, a unique characteristic is that they have very large fenestrations, pores. Because they contain the pores, this is going to lead to an increase in permeability. So some larger structures are able to move back and forth out of this capillary type. This capillary type is found in very special locations in the body. In your kidney and small intestine are great examples. If we look at the picture above, we can see the fenestrations, the pores right here. So this is a big reason why there's an increase in permeability, is because of that characteristic that they have. So the fenestrations, the pores. So more permeable to fluids and small solutes. And ultimately this capillary type functions when it comes to absorption. This is referring to nutrient absorption. So this is going to allow for the movement of nutrients, when we think of in your gut, in your intestine, out. And important for the forming of filtrate, when we think about that in the kidney, in the nephron. And ultimately, in turn, the filtrate eventually becomes urine. Number 3, Third type of capillary in your body is the sinusoidal capillary. This is by far the most permeable, and we typically find the sinusoidal capillary in your liver, bone marrow, and the spleen. It also can be found in the adrenal medulla, which is found in the adrenal gland. The reason for the increased permeability significantly from the other two capillary types is because of the large intercellular clefts. So look at these large gaps, these openings here. That's going to allow for a lot more materials to move in and out of this capillary type. So that's a big reason. So very large molecules and blood cells, such this picture shows, the erythrocyte you see there, red blood cells, are able to easily move out, in and out. And it makes sense when we look at these locations too, that, oh yeah, remember back to our first chapter we went over on blood, right? These locations is also where these erythrocytes, red blood cells, are recycled and broken down. So those are the three major capillary types, so definitely make sure to know those and review those. We're now going to spend some time looking at capillary beds. Capillary beds. A capillary bed is made up of a network of capillaries that ultimately form microcirculation between arterioles and venules. So the capillary bed is made up of two major types of vessels. Number one, true capillaries. These are considered to be the actual exchange vessels, are the true capillaries. And depending upon the tissue served in the body or the organs in the body, like the heart or the intestine, etc., there could be anywhere between 10 to 100 exchange vessels per capillary bed. So in this diagram here, ultimately this is a capillary bed. Okay, and here we have the true capillaries, okay? And then the other structure that's a part of a capillary bed is the vascular shunt. This is the part of the capillary bed that directly connects the terminal arteriole and the postcapillary venule. So we can see that here in the image here. This portion of the capillary bed is the vascular shunt, okay? Is the vascular shunt. Just like in the above image, I circled the true capillaries. Here we have the true capillaries. True capillaries. So now we take a look and see how does it work with blood flow through a capillary bed, and also looking at the anatomy. We'll first look at the above picture here, and here we have the terminal arteriole. We start off with oxygen-rich blood, okay, so oxygen-rich blood, and the blood flow goes through the terminal arteriole here, and eventually then makes its way into the capillary bed. What we find here are precapillary sphincters, and we're looking at an example here where the sphincters are open. When the sphincters are open, blood is able to flow through the true capillaries. So here we can see with those arrows, sphincters open, blood's flowing through. And ultimately, that oxygen then can make its way to tissues. The other side then of the capillary bed, you can see is blue now because the oxygen would have left here to tissue cells. And on this side here, the CO2 leaves the tissue cells, goes back into the capillaries. So hence blue for the low amount of oxygen. And then eventually that blood flow gets into the postcapillary venule. The true capillaries found here and here. So an example where the sphincters are open would be considering food digestion. Because when you're eating a lot of food, and maybe you had a big breakfast or maybe a big lunch or dinner, there's going to be more blood flow that needs to be in the stomach and small intestine area. More blood needs to go through those capillaries, and so the sphincters are going to be in the open position. Okay, open position. In contrast, if we look at the below picture, here we can see the sphincters are closed. So now, when it comes to blood flow, goes through that terminal arterial, and now the sphincters are closed. So you just have a little bit of blood flow going through, and that's only through the vascular shunt, right? This is the vascular shunt, this portion here of the capillary bed. You have no blood flow then going through the true capillaries. So this is an example where they're closed between meals. Okay, so several hours later, the food's been digested. You don't need as much blood flow going through the stomach and intestine. The blood flow can be distributed somewhere else. This same type of scenario can be even in effect when we think of exercise. Okay, so when someone is exercising, they're doing their run, okay? So someone's in the gym, right? Somebody's in the gym. They're going for a run, okay? So they're working out in their gym. They're going for a run, right? And somebody's happy. They're going to go running. They're going to work out, right? They're going to go run 5 miles or something like that on the treadmill or whatever it might be. You're going to need more blood flow going through the skeletal muscles in the heart. So the sphincters would be open and more blood flow going through the capillary bed here. Okay? More blood flow would be going through the skeletal muscles if you're working out in the gym and you're going for a run. In contrast, we go down here now, and again, the sphincters are closed. You only have a little bit of blood flow going through that vascular shunt from a terminal arterial to a postcapillary venule. So in regards to blood flow going through skeletal muscles now, you're probably done running. You're all done running now. Now you've left. You've left the gym. You're done running, and maybe you're chilling on the couch at home. Okay. So now this is awful, but this is supposed to be your couch, and now you're just chilling at home now. So you're watching your favorite TV program or something, and now you're really in the state of rest. So you don't need as much blood flow going through your muscles now. So hopefully this makes some sense here. All right, so this diagram here is looking at the relative proportion of blood volume throughout the cardiovascular system at any given period of time. And at any given period of time, the majority of blood flow will be found in the veins. Okay, the systemic veins, venules. So ultimately referring to the veins. Other areas of the body, you can see the percentage is significantly lower. We look at systemic arteries and arterioles, and the pulmonary blood vessels, and the heart, and the capillaries. You can see the values are significantly lower in comparison to the veins. Okay, so the veins here can contain up to 65% of the body's blood supply at any given period of time. So again, that makes sense when we looked at the beginning of lecture, the large cross-sectional area that you have internally in the veins, that lumen area, why that's a lot larger than the artery. Okay, so a couple things to review again when we look at veins, right? Here are some unique adaptations that they have, which assist to return the blood to the heart. One that I've mentioned before, veins have the large diameter lumens, offers very little resistance. Of course, veins are under low blood pressure. And then you have a lot of veins that have valves, and this helps to prevent backflow of blood. For the most part, they're found in your extremities, very abundant in the veins of the limbs, so your extremities, arms, and legs. And this picture here kind of shows this when you have your valves working normally, and the valves here prevent backward blood flow, ultimately trying to help to shuttle that blood towards the heart. In comparison here to valves that are not working properly, and now you have blood that's flowing backwards here versus blood going towards the heart, some going backwards, and you end up with what's known as varicose veins. So this leads us into looking now at varicose veins. So varicose veins, they're typically twisted veins and dilated, and that's because they become incompetent, leaky. So some adults have this. Greater than 15% of adults have varicose veins. There's many risk factors for why they can develop. One is your genetics ultimately. It could be from prolonged standing. It could be obesity. Someone's overweight and there's a lot of stress on the body. So you have the varicose veins developing. Typically they develop on the legs, these varicose veins. Pregnancy can do it, or even a bowel movement can lead to varicose veins. Hemorrhoids, I'm sure you've heard of those before. Those are extremely lovely from what I hear, and they can be from the result of varicose veins, and usually they develop in the anal canal. And hemorrhoids, a big risk factor there, of course, is someone that's not getting enough fruits and vegetables in their diet, and constipation, and that's a lot of pressure down there, and you can end up getting varicose veins there, and lots of inflammation. There's internal hemorrhoids, external hemorrhoids, very, very painful, and sometimes there's a lot of blood that sometimes is associated, so ultimately surgery is probably an option for these people. So very, very lovely. Gotta love hemorrhoids. All right, so now we're going to review, and here's our first review question today. Number 1. All right, so number 1, this tunic wall layer called the blank is found to be very thick in an artery in contrast to a vein and plays a role in maintaining blood pressure and circulation. So based off of these choices, what would be the correct answer here? All right, and the correct answer here, I would go with letter B. So the tunica media. Number 2 for review. Blood travels from an artery to a blank. So based off of these choices, blood would travel from an artery to a what? All right. And the correct answer here, I would go with choice letter D. So arterial would be the correct answer, right? So you have your arteries over here, right? So your artery types we've mentioned before. And then we get to the arterioles, right? So the arterial would be over here. So arterial over here. And then your capillary down here. Number 3, which of the following is not an example of a muscular artery? Which of the following is not an example of a muscular artery? So based off of these choices, what would be the correct answer here? All right. And the correct answer here, I would go with, how about choice letter D? So, letter D, the common carotid artery is not a muscular artery because instead it's an elastic artery, right? Elastic artery. Number 4 for review. Blank contain pores and are found in the kidneys and small intestine. They assist with nutrient absorption and filtrate formation. So what type of capillary are we referring to here for review? All right. And the correct answer here, I would go with choice letter B. Fenestrated capillaries would be the correct answer here. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and